There's a moment, and I know you've felt it, even if you've never been able to name it, where everything goes quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get after a long day, sitting on a porch with a cold drink and nothing to worry about. I mean the other kind. The kind where the air itself seems to hold its breath. Where your ears are still picking up sound, but your brain has stopped processing it because something in your gut, something older than language, older than civilization, is saying, pay attention. Something is about to change. That's the moment I want to tell you about. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were always the worst shift rotation on Relay Station Delphi 7. And I had just finished my fourth consecutive Tuesday on the lower observation deck when the Vale transport docked and everything began to unravel. But let me back up. My name is Corporal Darius Mwangi, 26 years old, born in Nairobi, raised between there and Vancouver, and somehow ended up as one of 43 humans currently assigned to a deep space relay station perched at the edge of the Karthari belt. I was not a decorated soldier. I was not a prodigy. I had no legendary exploits, no family history in the military, no remarkable story about why I enlisted. I joined because I was 21 and the Earth Coalition was offering tuition credits, and I thought the deep space deployment would look interesting on a resume. That's it, that's the whole story. I was, by every metric that the Galactic Compact used to measure personnel worth, entirely unremarkable. And I want you to hold on to that because it matters. It matters more than anything else I'm about to say. The Galactic Compact, for those who don't know, and 3 years ago, I didn't know either, is the governing body of 47 spacefaring species. They've been around for roughly 6,000 years, give or take a few centuries depending on which calendar system you're using. 6,000 years of interstellar diplomacy, warfare, trade agreements, cultural exchange, and everything in between. Humans had been members for 11 years. 11 years out of 6,000. We were, as one Vale diplomat had memorably put it during our entry ceremony, a promising but as yet unproven addition to the greater tapestry of known civilization. Which is a very diplomatic way of saying, we have no idea what you're capable of, and we're reserving judgment until we see it. The problem was that nobody expected us to be capable of much. It wasn't malice, I want to be clear about that. The species that made up the compact weren't cruel about it, they were just accurate by their own standards. Humans were small. We were fragile by the measurements that mattered in open space. No natural radiation shielding, no toxin resistance, limited sensory range, average lifespans that the Vale considered tragically brief. We couldn't see into the ultraviolet spectrum the way the Keth could. We didn't have the Morhan's natural magnetic sense. We couldn't survive pressure differentials that most armored species shrugged off without a second thought. What we had, as far as the compact could see, was enthusiasm and a worrying tendency to volunteer for things we didn't fully understand. They weren't wrong about any of it. What they were wrong about was what it meant. Relay Station Delphi 7 sat at the intersection of 3 major shipping corridors and served as a communications hub for about 200 light-years of contested territory. Contested being a polite word for the ongoing border dispute between the Compact and the Drath sovereignty, a conflict that had been technically cold for about 80 years, occasionally hot for about 40 of those, and was currently sitting in an uneasy truce that nobody trusted and everybody violated. The station was about the size of a small city, crewed by roughly 4,000 personnel from 11 different species. Humans made up the smallest contingent, 43 of us, mostly in support roles, communications, logistics, maintenance, low-priority security rotations. We were not in command of anything significant. We were not trusted with any sensitive operations. When Admiral Keshvarani, the Vale officer who ran the station, held her senior staff briefings, there was exactly one human in the room, Lieutenant Commander Priya Akaffer, our ranking officer, who sat at the far end of the table and was never asked a direct question. That was just how things were. And for the most part, the 43 of us had accepted it. We ate together, complained together about the air recycling system, which smelled vaguely of burned copper on good days, watched old movies on whoever had the biggest screen, and did our jobs. The jobs were boring. The jobs were exactly as boring as you'd expect when no one trusts you with anything interesting. I spent most of my shifts monitoring communication traffic on the lower observation deck. My workstation was a standard terminal, comfortable enough. slightly too tall for human ergonomics, which was a problem across the board since the station had been built to veil specifications. My chair was a modified version of the standard issue, with 3 extra cushions I'd borrowed from the medical bay and never returned. My partner on the lower deck was a veil technician named Sarah Vatun. She was about 6 feet tall, iridescent blue-green skin, 4-fingered hands, and the kind of perpetually patient expression that I eventually realized wasn't patience at all, but rather the veil physiological equivalent of polite indifference. She wasn't unkind to me. She answered questions when I asked them, covered shifts when I needed coverage, and occasionally shared the veil equivalent of dried fruit, which tasted like if a plum and a piece of chalk had a child. She also, without any obvious malice, frequently forgot that I was in the room. Not in a rude way, in the way you forget about a piece of furniture that's always been there. You don't ignore it intentionally. It just doesn't demand your attention. I was, to Sarah Vatun and to most of the station, simply a fixture. Background noise, part of the environment. I had been on Delphi 7 for 18 months. I had 30 more to go on my initial deployment. And then on a Tuesday, the Veil transport docked. I knew something was off before I had any reason to know it. I was running routine traffic monitoring, mostly boring stuff, commercial frequencies, compact administrative chatter, the occasional ping from Keth patrol ships doing their circuit, when I noticed something in the data that shouldn't have been there. Not shouldn't have been there in a dramatic, alarm-triggering way. The station's automated systems hadn't flagged it. Sarah Vatun, sitting 3 meters to my left, hadn't reacted. The ambient sound of the deck hadn't changed. But there was a pattern in the background noise of the communication traffic. A rhythm, something cycling at irregular intervals that was just slightly too regular to be random. If you weren't looking for it, and by looking, I mean really looking, the way you do when you've been staring at the same frequencies for 18 months, and you know what random looks like so well that anything else stands out like a wrong note in a familiar song, you'd never catch it. I caught it, and I didn't know what it was. I spent 40 minutes going back through archived traffic, pulling comparison data from the previous 6 weeks, running it against standard interference patterns, equipment malfunctions, known natural phenomena in the belt. Nothing matched. The pattern was artificial. That much was clear. It was too precise to be anything else. But it wasn't in any frequency band that correlated with known hostile communication protocols, and it wasn't triggering any of the station's threat detection algorithms. Which either meant it was nothing, or it meant it was something the station's systems hadn't been programmed to recognize. I pulled up my communication log and started drafting a report to Sarah Vatun. Stopped. Thought about how many times in 18 months I'd flagged something I thought was worth noting and been told, politely, that it had been reviewed and was within normal parameters. I thought about Lieutenant Commander Ockhaffer's standing orders about not escalating signals intelligence without chain-of-command review, a protocol that, in practice, meant things went up the chain slowly and came back within normal parameters, attached like a reflex response. I thought about the pattern in the traffic, cycling just slightly too regularly to be random. And then I did something that, looking back, changed everything. I didn't file a report through the standard chain. I opened a secondary terminal and started working. What I need to explain here, and I'm aware this requires patience, so I appreciate you sticking with me, is what was happening in the wider war at the time, because none of what came after makes sense without it. The Drath sovereignty had been quiet for about 4 years. The truce, such as it was, had held longer than most analysts expected. The general consensus among compact military intelligence was that the Drath were consolidating after the losses they'd taken at Farron Station, a battle that happened a decade ago, and that I'd studied in my basic deployment briefing as an example of why interspecies coordination was critical in modern space warfare. The short version, the compact had won at Farron Station, but barely, and the victory had cost them 3 major fleet assets and the better part of 2 allied species expeditionary forces. The Drath had withdrawn to their core systems, and in the 4 years since, they hadn't done anything overtly aggressive. Border probes, yes. Minor violations of the truce exclusion zones, certainly, but nothing that qualified as a resumption of active hostilities. What compact intelligence had not publicly reported, though it had been circulating in the kind of whispered speculation that travels through any military installation, in break rooms and maintenance corridors and the long, boring hours of night shifts, was that the Drath had been doing something in those 4 years. Something with their fleet. Something that the long-range observation posts kept picking up fragments of, but nobody had gotten a complete picture of, because the Drath's exclusion zones were enforced with enough teeth that sending observation assets too close was an invitation for an incident. The speculation at its most alarming was that the Drath had developed something, a new weapon system or a new tactical approach, or both, something that would make the next engagement look nothing like the last one. That speculation had never been confirmed. It had never been formalized into official intelligence assessment. It existed, as most frightening things do, in the space between what was known and what was feared. And that pattern I'd found in the background noise of the traffic. I was 30 minutes into my secondary analysis when I started to think it might be relevant to that space. I worked through the rest of my shift and well into what should have been my off hours. My bunk was a 6x8 compartment on level 4 that I shared with nobody, which was a minor miracle of scheduling, and one of the few genuinely comfortable things about my existence on Delphi 7. I didn't go to my bunk. I found an unused secondary terminal in the communications analysis section, the section that was technically off-limits to my clearance level, but that had a door code I'd learned 6 months earlier when I'd been sent to fix a malfunctioning atmospheric sensor, and had watched the technician punch it in. And I settled in with a self-heating ration pack and about 12 hours of work ahead of me. The thing about pattern analysis, the real kind, is that it's not sophisticated in the way people imagine. It doesn't require some kind of massive computational breakthrough or exotic algorithm. What it requires is time and patience and the willingness to look at the same data from enough different angles that eventually the shape of the thing becomes clear. I had been doing signal monitoring for 18 months. 18 months of the same frequencies, the same noise profiles, the same everything. I knew this traffic the way a musician knows a song they've played 1,000 times, not consciously, not in the analytical way where you can recite the notes, but in the way where your hands know where they're going before your brain gives the instruction. The pattern I'd found wasn't in the communication content. It was in the carrier wave structure, in the way the signal propagated through the background radiation of the Carthari belt. It was, and I remember the moment I understood this, really understood it, as clearly as I remember anything in my life, it was a ranging signal, a passive sensor sweep. Someone was mapping the station's response profile to incoming signals, not trying to communicate, trying to understand the shape of the station's detection capabilities. Someone was finding out what we could see. And because the sweep was passive, because it was riding the existing traffic rather than generating new signals, the station's active threat detection systems had never been built to look for it. I sat back in the chair that was too tall for me and stared at the terminal for a long time. The Veil transport had docked 3 hours ago. Whatever was on it, whoever was on it, had arrived at the same time the pattern intensity had increased. I thought about the 4 years of Drath quiet. I thought about the speculation about what they'd been building in that silence. I thought about a passive ranging signal that nobody had flagged, riding the traffic of a relay station that sat at the intersection of 3 major shipping corridors in contested space. And then I thought, what do you do when you know something that nobody thinks you're capable of knowing? I could have gone to Lieutenant Commander Ockhaffer. The correct answer, the textbook answer, was to go to Ockhaffer. She was my commanding officer. She was the one who was supposed to handle anything that crossed my desk that was above my pay grade, which was most things. But here's the problem. I had been on this station for 18 months. Ockhaffer had been here for 3 years. In 3 years, she had filed, by my rough count, somewhere between 60 and 80 signals intelligence reports through proper channels. I had watched the responses come back, over and over, with the polished courtesy of a bureaucracy that had been smoothly functioning for 6,000 years, and had no particular reason to take the anomalies reported by the junior humans in a support role as anything other than enthusiastic overanalysis. Compact intelligence had entire departments, experienced analysts, centuries of established methodology. The idea that a human corporal on a Tuesday night shift had found something their systems had missed was, from their perspective, essentially impossible. And they would be polite about it. They would review the data. They would thank me for the report. And they would find a way to explain it within existing parameters, because that was what institutional systems did when presented with information that didn't fit the established framework. They didn't reject it violently. They just quietly filed it somewhere it wouldn't cause disruption. I had a pattern in the traffic that I was increasingly certain was a Drath passive ranging operation. I had a time correlation with the arrival of the Veil transport that I couldn't explain. I had approximately zero credibility with anyone on this station who had the authority to act on it. And I had 12 hours before my next scheduled shift, after which there would be a handover, and the data I'd isolated would be absorbed into the routine archive. And the window, whatever it was, whatever it meant, would either open or close without us being ready for it. So I did the other thing. I started looking for proof. Here's what I knew about proof from 18 months of watching how this station worked. It wasn't enough to identify a pattern. Anyone can point at a pattern. Patterns are everywhere. The human brain is literally built to find them whether they're there or not. The intelligence analysis system of the Galactic Compact had a formal 7-stage verification protocol for signals anomalies, and a human corporal on a Tuesday night was not in a position to walk any of those stages. What I needed was something concrete, something that didn't require anyone to trust my interpretation, something that would be undeniable on its own without the context I'd built that I could point to and say, "Look at this, right here, tell me what you see." I spent the next 4 hours reconstructing the ranging signal from first principles. Not the interpretation, the raw signal itself, stripped of the background traffic it was writing, displayed in a visualization format that didn't require any specialized knowledge to read. I built the comparison data set, what random background noise looked like in the Carthari belt, what natural interference patterns looked like, what known equipment malfunction signatures looked like, and I laid them all alongside the pattern I'd found, in a format that any first-year signals analyst could read in 30 seconds. Then I went back to the time correlation. The Veil transport had docked at 3:17 station time. The pattern intensity had increased at 3:12. Not after the docking, before it, which meant whatever was generating the increased sweep had anticipated the transport's arrival, which meant either it was connected to the transport, or it had intelligence about the transport's schedule that allowed it to time its activity accordingly. Both of those possibilities were bad. But the second one was much worse. Because if someone had advanced knowledge of the transport's schedule, they had a source inside the Compact's logistics network. And that changed everything. That wasn't a border probe or a ranging operation. That was preparation. I pulled the transport's manifest. Checked my access level. I didn't have clearance for the full manifest, but I had enough visibility into the docking logs to see the basic registration and declared cargo. Standard diplomatic courier, registered out of the Compact's administrative hub in the Ethian system. Declared cargo. Cultural exchange materials, administrative documents, and 8 high-value diplomatic personnel for what was listed as a routine coordination meeting with station command. 8 high-value diplomatic personnel for a routine coordination meeting on a deep space relay station at the edge of contested territory. I stared at that for a long time. Then I pulled up everything I could find about current Compact diplomatic initiatives in the Carthari region, which was, because of my clearance level, not very much. But it was enough to know that there was no scheduled coordination meeting on the current calendar, nothing that had been announced to station personnel. An unannounced diplomatic meeting, 8 high-value personnel. A passive ranging signal that had intensified exactly 5 minutes before their arrival. On a station sitting at the intersection of 3 major shipping corridors in disputed territory. And nobody on this station knew any of it. Except me. I want to tell you something about fear, because I think people misunderstand it. They think fear is what happens when you know you're in danger. But that's not really fear, that's adrenaline, that's the fight or flight response. That's your body doing what it was built to do. Real fear is what happens when you understand the shape of a situation, and you know that there's a gap between what's happening and what anyone around you thinks is happening, and you realize that gap might kill people. That's what I felt at 5:47 station time. Sitting in an unauthorized terminal in the communications analysis section of Relay Station Delphi 7, with a data package on my secondary drive that I was increasingly convinced represented the opening move of something catastrophic. I was scared, and I was completely alone with it. I thought about the 43 other humans on this station. I thought about the 4,000 other personnel. I thought about the 8 diplomatic personnel who had arrived on a transport that nobody had been expecting, and whatever it was they'd walked into. And then I thought about something my mother used to say back in Nairobi when I was a kid, and I was scared of something and I was trying to find a reason not to act on it. She'd look at me with that specific expression she had, not disappointed, not impatient, just absolutely level, and she'd say, "Darius, you already know what you need to do. You're just hoping someone is going to come tell you it's okay to do it." I was hoping someone was going to come tell me it was okay. Nobody was going to come. I pulled out my personal communicator, not the station network, the personal device that used a point-to-point channel that didn't route through the main system. I had one contact on that channel that mattered right now. Not Akafer, she'd route it through protocol, and it would arrive on Admiral Keshvarani's desk in about 4 hours. Not security, same problem. I had an emergency contact number that had been included in my initial deployment briefing, buried in paragraph 14 of an orientation document that I suspected most people never read past paragraph 3. It was a compact emergency intelligence relay, a direct channel to the Interspecies Crisis Assessment Unit, used for exactly the kind of situation where normal reporting structures weren't going to work fast enough. I was a corporal. I had no authority to use this channel. Using it without authorization from a commissioned officer was technically an infraction serious enough to end my military career. I called it. What happened next is something I've told about a dozen times to various debriefers and officers and committee representatives, and every time I tell it I'm aware that it sounds like something that didn't happen the way I'm describing it. But I was there, and I am telling you exactly how it was. The channel connected. There was a moment of the specific electronic hiss that meant you were going through high-security encryption, and then a voice, not synthesized, a real voice with the particular resonance of a Moorhen speaker which sounds like someone talking through a bass guitar said, "Relay 6, identify." "Corporal Darius M. Wangi," I said. "Earth Coalition personnel, Relay Station Delphi 7. I have a Class 3 signals anomaly with time correlation to unscheduled diplomatic arrival and evidence of pre-coordinated intelligence breach." There was a pause, not a long one, 3 seconds, maybe 4, but in those 3 seconds I became acutely aware of how this sounded. A corporal on an unauthorized channel, in the middle of the night, with an anomaly that the station's own systems hadn't flagged. "Corporal M. Wangi," the voice said, "transmit your data package." I transmitted it. Another pause, this one longer, maybe 20 seconds. I sat in the unauthorized terminal room with the remains of my ration pack and the hum of the station's life support, and I waited. "Stand by," the voice said. I stood by. What I found out later, much later, after most of the classified elements had been declassified and the formal review process had run its course, was that the compact emergency intelligence relay received about 300 unsolicited contacts per standard year from various personnel across the compact's deployed forces. Of those 300, roughly 280 were either equipment malfunctions, well-intentioned but incorrect analysis, or individuals who had misread the emergency contact protocol and thought it was a general helpline. Of the remaining 20 or so that contained genuine intelligence, the overwhelming majority came from senior analysts with established track records and high clearance ratings. People the unit already knew, people they could evaluate based on prior performance. The number of times in the unit's entire 600-year operational history that a contact had come from a human, let alone a human corporal with an entry-level clearance and 18 months of deployment experience, was exactly one. This one, the analyst who fielded my call, was a Moorhen named Ixtharvel, and I know his name because he told it to me later. At the time, he was just the voice on the other end of the channel who had 20 seconds of silence and then said, "Stand by," while he, according to his own account, stared at the data package I'd sent and tried to figure out what to make of it. Here's what he told me he thought, in that 20 seconds. He thought either a very junior human had made a sophisticated analytical error that coincidentally resembled genuine intelligence, or a very junior human had, somehow, found something his unit's own monitoring systems had missed. He said later that the deciding factor for him was the baseline comparison data I'd included, the random noise profiles, the natural interference patterns, the fact that I had thought before sending anything to build the case from the ground up so that nobody would need to trust my interpretation. He'd seen senior analysts fail to think of that. He said it was the most useful thing in the package. He escalated, not to station command, not through normal channels. He escalated directly to the crisis assessment team's active watch officer, who was a Vale named Saren Key, who looked at the data, ran it through a higher classification analysis framework that the station's systems weren't configured for, and identified the ranging signal as consistent with DRATH pre-engagement reconnaissance methodology. Consistent with, not confirmed as, the language was careful but consistent with. And what that meant was, someone needed to talk to the 8 diplomatic personnel who had arrived on an unscheduled transport at a station that might, right now, be the subject of active DRATH reconnaissance. That conversation had to happen in the next. I checked the time. 6:23. In the next 4 hours, before the station's morning shift rotation began and the security profile changed, and whatever window existed closed. The voice on the channel came back. Different this time, not Ixtharvel, someone else higher up. The tone was different, still calm, but a different kind of calm, the kind of calm that's being maintained deliberately. Corporal Mwangi, this is Watch Commander Saren Key. I need you to do something for me. Yes, sir, I said. And then, because I was 26 years old and scared and running on no sleep and a self-heating ration pack. What? What Saren Key needed me to do was the strangest and most frightening thing I've ever been asked to do in my life, and the list includes some genuinely alarming items. She needed me to stay at my terminal and continue the monitoring, not report to a superior, not trigger any station alerts, not change anything about my apparent activity. Because if the ranging signal was what they thought it was, and if the diplomatic transport was connected to it in the way the time correlation suggested, then whoever was running this operation had at minimum one source inside the compact's communications infrastructure. Routing anything through standard channels meant potentially alerting that source. The only channel that hadn't been potentially compromised was the one I'd used, the personal emergency relay, point to point, no routing through station networks. They needed me to keep the monitoring going, keep building the data picture, and feed it exclusively through that channel until they could get a response asset to our position. A response asset, that was the phrase she used. How long, I asked. Approximately 6 hours. 6 hours. I looked at the time. My next scheduled shift began at 800. If I didn't show up for it, and showing up for it meant abandoning the terminal and rejoining the normal station routine, someone would notice. Someone would come looking. And if whoever was running the intelligence operation had a source in communications, a human corporal behaving out of pattern was exactly the kind of thing that might trigger a response. I'll be marked absent at 800, I said. I know. We'll handle that. How? A brief pause. Lieutenant Commander Akafer has been read in. She'll cover your absence through internal scheduling. She'll report you as assigned to a maintenance task. Akafer, read in. I wondered what that conversation had been like, receiving a call at whatever time it was right now with the news that her corporal had been running unauthorized communications and had apparently stumbled into an active intelligence situation. I had a feeling I was going to be hearing about it in significant detail at some point in the future. Understood, I said. Mwangi, a pause, the kind with something at the end of it. The ranging signal, you said the intensity increased before the transport docked. Yes, by about 5 minutes. Is it still active? I checked. The pattern was there, cycling at its regular, slightly too regular rhythm. But the intensity had changed again, increased further, and the frequency had shifted just slightly, just enough to be noticeable if you knew what you were looking at. It's still active, I said, but the frequency has shifted. I ran the comparison. It's now consistent with a targeting calibration sweep. Another pause, longer. Copy that, Saren Key said. Her voice was completely level, professionally, impressively level. Mwangi, keep monitoring, keep the channel open. Do not move from that terminal unless I tell you to. Yes, sir. And Mwangi. Sir, good work. The channel didn't close entirely. It stayed as a low-power background connection, a thread between me and whoever was on the other end. I turned back to the terminal. The ranging signal was there, cycling, calibrating, painting a picture of Relay Station Delphi 7 with a precision that, the more I looked at it, was increasingly terrifying. I thought about what a targeting calibration sweep meant. I thought about the 8 diplomatic personnel, about the unscheduled meeting with Station Command, about 4 years of Drath quiet. About what you might be planning if you had 4 years to plan, if you knew that the compact was at its most complacent, and a relay station at the edge of contested space was hosting a set of high-value targets that you'd been waiting to locate in a single place. I thought they're not targeting the station. I opened a secondary analysis window and started cross-referencing the sweep pattern against the station's internal layout. Every relay station of this class had its layout in the public compact infrastructure registry, not classified, because there was no way to keep the architectural plans of something the size of a small city truly secret. The Drath would have them. 30 seconds of cross-referencing. The targeting sweep was focused on a single section of the station. Level 8 Forward Command Sector, the section that contained the primary conference room, where 8 high-value diplomatic personnel had arrived without announcement for a meeting that wasn't on the calendar. I opened the emergency channel. Watch, Commander, I have a targeting solution. They're not going for the station. They're going for the conference room on Level 8, surgical extraction or elimination of the diplomatic personnel. The response was almost instant. Confirmed. Mwangi, we are 7 minutes behind schedule on the response asset. I need you to listen carefully. Listening. The diplomatic personnel need to be moved. Not by security alert. If we trigger a station security protocol, we spook the source and the operation goes dark. We need them moved quietly, without a flag going through station communications. A silence that I think she was using to let the implications of what she was about to say settle before she said it. You're in the communications analysis section right now. Can you reach level 8 without going through a staffed checkpoint? I thought about the station's layout, the way I'd been wandering its corridors for 18 months, learning its shortcuts the way you learn any space you inhabit long enough. The maintenance access routes, the atmospheric processing tunnels that connected sections at irregular levels because of how the station had been expanded over 3 construction phases. Yes, I said. Then you need to get those people out of that conference room, personally, right now, without triggering anything in the station network. I was 26 years old. I was a corporal. I had no weapons, no tactical training beyond the absolute basics, and approximately 0 authority to walk into a high-level diplomatic meeting and tell a group of people with a combined rank that dwarfed anything I would achieve in my entire career that they needed to leave immediately. Yes, sir, I said. I moved. The atmospheric processing tunnels were not built for human beings. They weren't built for Vale either. They were maintenance access for the automated systems that maintained the station's environmental controls, which meant they were approximately half a meter wide and ran at angles that assumed your joints bent in directions that mine didn't particularly want to bend in. I made it from the communications analysis section to the level 8 access point in 9 minutes. I know because I was tracking it. 9 minutes of moving through spaces that smelled like ozone and recycled air, hunched over, navigating by memory and the faint service lighting that ran along the tunnel walls. I caught my shoulder on a conduit fitting hard enough to leave a bruise I'd find later, and at one point I had to flatten myself against the tunnel wall to let an automated maintenance drone pass. The access panel for Level 8 led out into a utility alcove just outside the secondary corridor that connected to the forward command sector. I pushed it open, stepped out into the corridor, empty, 6:41 station time, the morning shift not yet active, and walked. Not ran, walked. Running in a military installation corridor is an alarm. Walking is just someone going somewhere. The forward command sector had a security checkpoint at the main entrance. I went around it. The secondary access route, a fire corridor that the compact's safety regulations required on every level, but that was rarely staffed because the automated suppression systems made it mostly redundant, opened with a standard maintenance override code that was, technically, above my clearance level, and that I also happened to know. I went through it, into the sector, down the corridor to the primary conference room. The door was a standard compact security door, biometrically locked, heavy, with a viewing panel that was currently opaque. I could hear voices from inside. Multiple species, by the resonance frequencies, at least 2 Veil, and something with a much lower register that might be Morhan. I put my hand on the door control and paused. This was the moment. On the other side of this door was, conservatively, more combined rank and diplomatic authority than I had ever been in a room within my entire life. I was a corporal. I was covered in tunnel grime. I smelled like ozone. I had no identification beyond my standard-issue personal communicator and a personal emergency relay channel that was currently carrying a classified intelligence operation. I had absolutely no idea how this was going to go. I keyed the door. The room went quiet instantly. There were 10 people in it. 8 whom I didn't recognize, a mix of species, most informal diplomatic attire, and 2 I did. Admiral Keshvarani, who looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as the specific look of a person confronting something so far outside their expectation that their brain hasn't caught up yet. And standing to one side and looking approximately as calm as anyone could look given the circumstances, Lieutenant Commander Priya Akaffer. Akaffer, she'd been read in. She'd got here before me. She must have taken the main corridor, uniform clean, credentials in order, everything by the book except the fact that she was in this room at 6:43 in the morning for a meeting nobody was supposed to know was happening. She met my eyes and gave me the smallest possible nod. "Corporal Mwangi," she said with a composure I still deeply respect. "Thank you for joining us." Admiral Keshvarani had moved from unexpected situation to controlled anger in about 4 seconds. "Commander Akaffer, what is the meaning of?" "Admiral," Akaffer's voice was precise. Not loud, not deferential, precise. "With respect, we have a time-critical security situation and approximately 6 minutes of margin. I will fully explain and accept full accountability for the chain of decisions that brought us here, including Corporal Mwanga's actions, after we have moved these personnel to a secure alternate location. Right now, I need you to trust me." Keshvarani was Veil. The Veil are not a species that responds well to junior personnel overriding command authority. Their culture is built on hierarchical order in a way that makes even the most rigid human military tradition look somewhat casual. In the 6,000 years of the Galactic Compact, I doubt there had been many moments where a Veil admiral had been told, by a human lieutenant commander, to trust her. Keshvarani looked at Akaffer, then at me, then at the 8 diplomatic personnel who were watching this with a range of expressions from alarmed to fascinated. Then she said, "Mwangi, talk." I talked for 3 minutes. I explained the signal pattern, the time correlation, the targeting sweep, where it was focused, what it meant. I pulled up the data on my personal communicator and showed it because the data made the argument better than I could alone. Keshvarani listened. She was very still while I talked. The Veil go very still when they're processing something unexpected. The 8 diplomatic personnel listened too. One of them tall, a species I didn't recognize, with deep amber coloring and patterns on their skin that shifted as they moved, pulled out their own device and started checking something while I spoke. When I finished, the room was quiet for about 2 seconds. The amber-colored diplomat said, "He's correct. The sweep pattern matches a Drath pre-strike protocol we've been tracking in theoretical models. We believe they've deployed it in live operational settings twice before. Both times, the target was eliminated before we identified the method." Everyone looked at them. "I'm from the Compact Intelligence Directorate," they said, with the tone of someone who had expected this conversation to go differently. "The meeting is not a coordination briefing. We came here because we received intelligence suggesting this station was being used as a staging point for a Drath intelligence operation. We were 2 hours away from briefing you." They looked at me. "You were 2 hours faster." The silence this time was different. Keshvarani turned to Akaffer. "Your corporal." "Yes, Admiral." "Unauthorized channel use. Unauthorized access to restricted sections. Interference with a classified intelligence operation." "Yes, Admiral." Keshvarani looked at me with something that I couldn't quite read, because Veil facial expressions required about 3 months of intensive study to interpret accurately, and I hadn't done that study. Corporal Mwangi, when did you identify the signal anomaly? Approximately 3:20, Admiral. And you spent, she calculated, over 3 hours analyzing it before making contact. I wanted to make sure I was right. Another pause, the kind that comes before something changes. We need to move, said the Amber Intelligence Directorate officer. Mwangi, the alternate route you used, can it take 10 people? It can, I said. But it's tight and it's not comfortable and... Lead the way. We moved through the atmospheric tunnels, 10 people in formal diplomatic attire and 1 grimy corporal, and the strike came 12 minutes later. I heard it rather than felt it first. A deep vibration through the structure, not an explosion, more like the station's frame absorbing an impact it wasn't designed to absorb. The lights flickered. The emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the tunnels in red-tinted white. The conference room we'd been in, Level 8, Forward Command Sector, took the first hit. I learned later that 3 separate Drath strike packages, delivered by micro-jump units that had been sitting in the background noise of the Belt's asteroid field for God knows how long, had detonated against the station's forward hull with enough precision to collapse the conference room and its immediate surroundings while leaving the rest of the station largely intact. Surgical, that was the word that kept coming up in the debrief reports. Surgical. They had been very precise. They had known where their targets were. They had been absolutely, completely certain that the 8 Compact Intelligence Directorate personnel and the station's admiral were sitting in that room. The room was empty. We were in the tunnels. I'll spare you the full accounting of the next 4 hours, mostly because a lot of it was dark tunnels and emergency systems, and the administrative chaos of a station that had just absorbed 3 precision strikes and was trying to figure out what had happened. The response asset that Saren Key had mentioned, a compact rapid response intelligence team, traveling under a separate cover that had kept them off the station's main manifest, arrived at 9:30 and began the process of identifying and neutralizing the Drath source that had been embedded in the station's communications network. There was indeed a source. A Keth technician, not malicious in the ideological sense, I was told, but compromised through blackmail over something I never got the details of, who had been feeding logistics data to a Drath cut out for the better part of 8 months. It was how they'd known about the transport. It was how they'd known about the diplomatic meeting that hadn't yet been announced through official channels. The source had been feeding the schedule, the ranging signal had been painting the target, the strike packages had been prepositioned. If the conference room had been occupied, every single person in it would have been dead. I sat in a corridor on level 3, back against the wall, knees up, watching the emergency lighting pulse its slow rhythm, and I thought about that. About the shape of what had almost happened, the gap between the way things had been going and the way they'd gone. At some point, HFY sat down next to me. She didn't say anything for a while, just sat there the way you sit next to someone when you know they need company more than words. After a while, she said, "You're in a lot of trouble, you know." I know. Unauthorized channel use, restricted access interference. I know. Also, apparently you still have 3 emergency medical bay pillows that you checked out 8 months ago. I looked at her. She had somehow found a moment to be funny. I thought that was one of the bravest things I'd seen all day. The channel worked, I said. The channel worked, she agreed. We sat there for another minute. Down the corridor, I could hear the response team working, the distant vibration of the station settling after the strikes. HFY, I said, the Intelligence Directorate officer. They said they were here because they thought the station was being used as a staging point. Yes. Did they know about the source in the network before they got here? A pause. They suspected, she said. They didn't have confirmation. And they were going to brief Keshvarani at 800. Yes. Standard channel briefing. Another pause, longer. Yes, HFY said very quietly. Standard channel briefing. I thought about that, about what would have happened if the briefing had gone through standard channels, about the source in the network who would have seen it, about the response time that would have cascaded from there. Mwangi. Sir, how did you know to use the emergency relay? Most people never read that far into the deployment briefing. I thought about my mother. About paragraph 14 of an orientation document, about the specific kind of attention you bring to reading something when you've been told your whole life that knowing things matters. I read everything, I said. The formal review process took 11 weeks. 11 weeks of depositions and data reviews and interagency consultations, and the particular grinding bureaucratic weight of a 6,000-year-old institution trying to figure out what to do with a situation it hadn't anticipated and a person it didn't have a category for. I want to be honest about what those 11 weeks were like, because I think there's a version of this story that skips them. That goes directly from the dramatic moment to the triumphant outcome, and that version is dishonest in a way that bothers me. The 11 weeks were awful, not in a physical way. I was moved to a review facility in the Ethian system, which was more comfortable than Delphi 7 by a significant margin. They were awful in the way that long, uncertain things are awful. The waiting, the not knowing, the replaying of every decision you made, and asking yourself if you made the right call or just got lucky. The unauthorized channel use was a serious infraction by any reading of the protocol. The restricted access compounded. If the data had been wrong, if I'd pulled 10 people through those tunnels for nothing, if the strike hadn't come, the consequences would have been meaningful and clear. But the strike had come, and the conference room had been empty, and 11 weeks of review eventually resolved into something I hadn't expected. The formal finding of the review board was complicated, and I'll let the official record speak for itself on most of it. The relevant summary, for our purposes, is this. Corporal Mwangi's unauthorized actions were technically infractions under 3 separate compact protocols. Those infractions were assessed as having prevented the targeted elimination of 8 senior intelligence directorate personnel and 1 station commander, disrupted an active Drath intelligence operation, and provided the initial data that led to the identification and neutralization of an embedded source that had been undetected for 8 months. The board voted 5-2 to classify the protocol infractions as unauthorized but justified actions under extraordinary circumstances, with a formal note on record but no punitive measures. The 2 who voted against did so on principle, not outcome. They were apparently both Vale. The Amber Intelligence Directorate officer, whose name, I learned during the review, was Tessira Vane, submitted a formal commendation that was approximately 4 times longer than standard, which she later told me was partly genuine and partly tactical, because in the Compact's administrative system, a longer formal document carries more institutional weight than a shorter one regardless of what it says. Admiral Keshvarani submitted her own assessment. It was brief. It was Vale in its precision and economy of language. It said, essentially, the humans saw something we missed, acted on it when our systems would have absorbed it, and the outcome speaks for itself. The question of authority and protocol is real. The question of result is also real. The board must weigh both. The board weighted both. And then there was the other thing. The Intelligence Directorate's post-incident analysis of the Drath operation yielded something that changed the wider strategic picture significantly. The passive ranging signal I'd identified, the specific methodology, the carrier wave riding technique, the targeting calibration pattern was not new. It was, as Tessira Vane explained to me in a briefing that I was very surprised to find myself attending, a technique the Drath had developed during the 4-year silence. And it had been used in various forms at 6 other locations in compact-controlled space over the past 18 months. 6 times, all 6 targets had been hit. None of the operations had been identified beforehand. The reason none of them had been identified, the analysis determined, was that the Drath had designed the signal specifically to sit below the detection threshold of standard compact monitoring systems. They hadn't just been running a passive sweep. They'd been running a survey of compact detection capabilities, station by station, learning exactly how sensitive each system was, calibrating their technique to stay just below the edge of what would trigger an alert. It was, Tessira Vane said, one of the most sophisticated signals intelligence operations they'd seen the Drath run. And the reason I'd caught it, she continued, was not because I had better equipment or higher clearance or more sophisticated analysis tools. All of those things were, objectively, worse than what the Compact's dedicated intelligence analysts had available. I'd caught it because of 18 months of the same frequencies every day, until random noise had a shape in my head that was as familiar as a face. Because the human brain, for all its limitations in the metrics the compact measured, was built for a particular kind of pattern recognition that didn't come from processing power. It came from the accumulated weight of attention over time, from familiarity, from the specific intelligence that develops when a person spends enough time in one place, with one set of data, to know it the way you know your own heartbeat. The Drath had calibrated their signal against compact sensor systems. They had not calibrated it against a human being who had been staring at the same frequencies for a year and a half. They hadn't thought to. Tessira Vane showed me in that briefing something that I don't think I'll ever fully stop thinking about. She pulled up the 6 prior attacks, showed me the signal data from each one, the same passive ranging technique, the same carrier wave methodology, the same targeting calibration pattern. All 6 had been in the data, recorded, archived, available to analysis teams. None had been flagged. Then she showed me the detection thresholds for the monitoring systems at each station, showed me where the Drath signal had been positioned relative to those thresholds, within 2 to 3% every time, just barely below the line. Consistent enough to be a calibrated, deliberate choice, not chance. They mapped our sensors, she said, precisely enough to stay invisible. I looked at the data for a while. You're going to recalibrate the thresholds. We already have, all stations as of 6 days ago. They'll know. She looked at me. They've been running this operation for 18 months, I said. They'll notice when their signal starts getting flagged. They'll recalibrate. Yes, she said, they will. So you need something that doesn't have a fixed threshold they can map against. She was quiet for a moment. What are you suggesting? I was 26 years old. I had been promoted 2 weeks prior to sergeant, a promotion that had been fast-tracked through a process that, I suspected, had involved a significant amount of administrative creativity at levels far above my own. I was sitting in an intelligence directorate briefing facility in the Ethian system, talking to a senior intelligence officer about a strategic problem that had been killing people for 18 months. I'm suggesting, I said, that the signal is designed to hide from systems. Systems have thresholds. Systems can be mapped. A system can't know what it doesn't know it should look for. I paused. But a person who knows what normal looks like, who's spent enough time with a specific set of data to know when something's off without being able to explain exactly why, that's different. You can't calibrate against intuition. You can't run a sensor survey against a gut feeling. Tessira Vane looked at me with an expression that I was starting to learn how to read, the particular stillness of someone who has thought about something extensively and is now looking at a new angle on it. Human intuition, she said. It's not magic, I said quickly. It's not something you can't replicate. It's just time and familiarity. It's what happens when a person lives with the same data long enough that they stop analyzing it and start knowing it. She was quiet for longer this time. The 6 stations, I said. All of them had monitoring personnel. How long had the personnel been in those roles? She checked. It took a minute. Average deployment, she said, was about 4 months. Station rotation kept assignments relatively short to prevent, she paused, to prevent fatigue. Fatigue, I said, right, and at Delphi 7. A shorter pause, 18 months. We both sat with that for a moment. The rotation policy exists for good reasons, she said. I know I'm not saying change the policy. I'm saying, I thought about how to phrase it. I'm saying there might be value in the thing that gets built when someone stays somewhere long enough to really know it, not instead of the systems, alongside them. In the frequencies where the systems can be mapped and adjusted around. Another silence. You know, Tessira Vane said, for a species that's only been in the compact for 11 years, you're asking very uncomfortable questions. I think that might be part of it, I said. I'm going to tell you what happened over the next 18 months. Not in the detail of the first part of this. There were no more moments of crawling through atmospheric tunnels with diplomats in formal attire, but in the shape of it, because the shape is what matters. Tessira Vane's formal proposal, submitted to the Intelligence Directorate 6 weeks after the Delphi 7 incident, recommended the creation of what she called a familiarization intelligence program. Longer tenure assignments for selected monitoring personnel, specifically in high-traffic communications positions, with the explicit goal of developing the kind of deep familiarity that I described. The program would operate alongside existing sensor systems, not as a replacement, but as a parallel layer, the kind of pattern recognition that couldn't be mapped against because it lived in the knowledge base of a person rather than the threshold setting of a machine. The recommendation specifically cited human personnel as a priority group for the program, for the reason I've described. Humans, short-lived by compact standards, were, in ways that the standard metrics hadn't captured, uniquely suited to the kind of intensive, sustained attention that the program required. Not because of any special sensory capability, but because of a specific relationship with time and focus that emerged from having less of the former, and therefore developing more of the latter. It was the first time, as far as I can find, that a compact intelligence directorate formal document had identified a human characteristic as a strategic asset rather than a limitation. It would not be the last. The Drath made their next move 8 months after Delphi 7. Not a targeted strike, something larger. A coordinated push at 3 points along the Carthari border, timed to coincide with what their intelligence had suggested would be a compact fleet rotation leaving a coverage gap. The coverage gap didn't exist. It had been anticipated. Not by advanced sensor systems, not by fleet positioning algorithms, but by a compact intelligence analyst named Yaren Oss, a Morhan who had been in the new familiarization program for 7 months, stationed at a communications relay on the opposite side of the Carthari belt from Delphi 7, who had noticed something in the traffic patterns that preceded fleet rotations, not in the fleet communications themselves, in the commercial and civilian traffic that surrounded them. The way civilian shipping adjusted its routing in the days before major fleet movements, responding to informal safety advisories that went out through non-military channels. A tell, a signature, visible only if you knew what normal looked like in granular detail. The Drath had been reading that signature to time their operations. Yaren Oss identified it. The fleet rotation was quietly adjusted. The expected coverage gap never materialized. The Drath push hit prepared positions and withdrew. It was reported as a successful defensive action. It was. But the more important thing, which didn't make it into the public reporting, was that the intelligence that had enabled it came from exactly the kind of familiarization-derived observation that Tessira Vane's program had been built around. The program was expanded, more stations, more species, a protocol for cultivating and surfacing the specific kind of intelligence that came from deep familiarity rather than systemic analysis. It was, by any measure, working. The third thing, and this is the one that I find hardest to tell, not because it's dramatic, but because it's the opposite, because it's small and quiet, and it's the part that actually changed everything, happened 14 months after Delphi 7. I was stationed at a new post by then, a coordination hub called Meridian 4, larger than Delphi 7, sitting at a more complex intersection of shipping lanes in a less contested region. My role had changed substantially. I was, technically, a senior intelligence analyst, a designation that had been created somewhat specifically for my situation, since the existing rank structures didn't have a clean place for junior military personnel who had been cross-designated into an intelligence function after an unusual set of circumstances. I was running a monitoring team, not a large one, 6 people, 3 species including 2 humans and a Vale and a Keth. All of them had been selected for the familiarization program. All of them had been in their current assignments long enough to know the traffic the way I'd known it at Delphi 7. We caught 3 anomalies in those 14 months. 2 turned out to be equipment issues. 1 turned out to be a Drath passive survey in its earliest stage, not a targeting calibration, just the initial mapping sweep, and we flagged it early enough that the response team was positioned before the survey completed. Nobody was killed. No strikes occurred. The operation dissolved without resolution on the Drath end because the survey never finished and they had no targeting data. We never made the news. It didn't generate the kind of dramatic account that gets told, the way the Delphi 7 story got told. There was no conference room evacuation through atmospheric tunnels at 600 with diplomats in formal attire. There was just 6 people who knew their frequencies well enough to notice when something was wrong, and who were trusted enough to act on it. That's the part that mattered. I've thought a lot over the years since about what the lesson of this whole sequence of events actually was. Not the tactical lesson, that's the easy version, the one that gets presented in briefings. The tactical lesson is, passive ranging operations can be countered by personnel-based familiarization intelligence. Here's the methodology, here's the program structure. Clear, implementable, done. The deeper lesson is harder to articulate, which is maybe why it doesn't get as much time in the briefings. The Compact had spent 11 years treating human integration as a process of accommodation. The question was always some version of, how do we work around human limitations? How do we account for the things humans can't do? What roles can we put them in where their fragility and their short deployment tolerance and their limited sensory range won't be a liability? It was a reasonable question to ask. None of those limitations were wrong. What it missed was the other direction. Not, what can't humans do? But, what have humans built in 40,000 years of doing everything with inadequate equipment and insufficient time that looks like nothing the Compact had seen before? Not better hardware, not superior capability, something else. Something that didn't have a name in the Compact's strategic vocabulary, because the Compact hadn't needed to name it. They'd had enough species with enough sensory range, and enough longevity that the particular thing humans had developed to compensate for having neither hadn't been something they'd ever had to think about. The particular thing was this: humans pay attention differently. Not better, differently. In the way that develops when you don't have 6,000 years to work with, when every moment of attention is expensive, when the signal-to-noise ratio of being alive is such that you've spent your entire evolutionary history becoming very, very good at knowing when something is wrong before you can explain why. The Compact had sensors for that, systems, algorithms. They were extraordinarily sophisticated. They were also, as the Drath had correctly identified, mappable. They had thresholds. They had parameters. They worked within defined operational bounds. The thing in my gut at 3:20 on a Tuesday in Relay Station Delphi 7 was not mappable. It did not have a threshold. It had no defined operational bounds. It just knew something was off. I was 32 years old when I gave the testimony that became part of the formal record of the Strategic Human Integration Review, a 3-year process that, among other things, fundamentally revised how the Compact thought about human capabilities and how human personnel were deployed and utilized across Compact military and intelligence structures. I was not the only person who gave testimony. Akafer gave testimony. Tessira Vane gave testimony. Yaron Os gave testimony. 17 other individuals gave testimony. The review process was enormous and complicated and involved a significant amount of interspecies disagreement about methodology and implication. My testimony was not the most important part of the process. I want to be clear about that because I've heard the story told in ways that position me as the person who changed everything, and that's not accurate. I was one thread in a much larger weave. I was the incident that started a conversation. The conversation is what changed things. But they did ask me, near the end of my testimony, what I thought the most important thing was that the Compact should understand about humans. I thought about it for a while before answering. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to say it correctly. We're not good at everything, I said. We're fragile. We don't live very long. Our sensory range is limited. All of that is real, and I don't think you should pretend otherwise. The review board, 7 members, 4 species, waited. But the things we're not good at, I said, taught us to be very, very good at the things we are good at. And I think those things, a lot of the time, are different from the things you're measuring. One of the board members, a Vale, tall even by Vale standards, whose name I never learned, asked, "What things?" I thought about Tuesday nights on a lower observation deck, about 3 hours of data analysis at an unauthorized terminal, about 9 minutes in an atmospheric tunnel, and a conference room full of people who were alive because a gut feeling had been worth acting on. The things you build, I said, when you don't have any other option. 6 months after the Strategic Integration Review filed its final report, I attended a ceremony at the Compact's administrative center in the Ethian system. I don't want to make too much of the ceremony. The Compact is extremely good at ceremonies in the way that 6,000-year-old institutions are good at things they've done many times. There were speeches in 6 languages. There was music that I found genuinely beautiful, and that I was later told represented a specific form of honor traditionally reserved for actions that changed the direction of compact history, which I found slightly overwhelming. There was formal recognition from multiple individuals and organizations connected to the Delphi 7 incident and the subsequent program and review. I received a formal commendation. I was, at that point, a major, another designation that had been fast-tracked through processes I'll spare you the bureaucratic detail of, and that Aukaffer had somehow managed to navigate while keeping her composure. But the thing I remember most from that day isn't the ceremony. It's a conversation I had afterward in one of the facility's public gardens, which were full of plants from a dozen different worlds and smelled, depending on which direction you were facing, like everything from fresh rain to warm metal. Admiral Keshvarani found me there. She looked exactly the same as she had in the conference room on level 8, minus the emergency lighting. Composed, precise. The specific veil expression I'd been studying long enough to read, not the polite indifference I'd mistaken it for at the beginning, but something more complex. Something that might, in a human face, look like respect in the process of being revised. She stood next to me for a moment, looking at the garden. Then she said, in the direct way that I'd come to understand was how Vale expressed sincerity, "I owe you an apology, Corporal." "Major," I said. "Major Mwangi." A pause. "I owe you an apology. The way this station functioned for your first 18 months, the way we thought about your role, your contribution. I was not wrong to follow procedure. But I was wrong in what the procedure was built on." I didn't say anything. "We assumed," she said, "that the measure of capability was the measure we had." "It's a reasonable assumption," I said. "It's a 6,000-year-old assumption," she said, "which is precisely why it should have been questioned more recently." She turned to look at me. "You questioned it." "I just read paragraph 14. She almost smiled. Veil almost smiles are a very subtle thing. "Will you be returning to active monitoring?" "For a while, then I think I'll move to training. The familiarization program needs," I thought about it. "It needs people who know how to explain what they're teaching, not just do it." "Teaching intuition." "Teaching familiarity," I said. "The intuition comes after." Keshvarani was quiet for a moment. "The Drath will adapt," she said. "Whatever we build, they'll find a way to work around it. That's the nature of it." "Yes," I said. "You're not troubled by that?" I thought about Tuesday nights, about the specific silence before something changes, about a pattern in the noise that shouldn't be there, visible only because I'd been looking at the same thing long enough that I knew what it looked like when it was right. "No," I said, "because we'll adapt too. That's the other nature of it." She stood there a moment longer. Then she said, "The 11 years will become 12 and 13 after that. I think we may have underestimated what that would mean." "I think," I said, "you weren't the only ones." Epilogue, paragraph 14. I'm telling you this story because someone asked me recently what I thought the moment was where everything changed. The single inflection point, the where it turned. And the answer I gave surprised them, I think. Because they were expecting the moment in the conference room, or the moment in the tunnel, or the moment I made the call on the unauthorized channel. And those were all significant moments. I won't minimize them. But the real moment, the one where the actual change was seated, was months before any of that. It was 18 months of showing up for a shift that nobody expected much from. 18 months of paying attention to something that nobody thought was important enough to pay close attention to. 18 months of being in the background, being the furniture, being the unremarkable human in the corner of the lower observation deck on a station built to veil proportions with borrowed cushions on my chair. The change didn't happen in a dramatic moment. It happened in the accumulation of all the ordinary ones, in all the Tuesdays before the Tuesday. The compact had 6,000 years of history and 47 spacefaring species and technology that could map the surface of a star in real time and sensor systems that could detect a positron emission at 12 light years. They had more of almost everything than we had. What they didn't have was 18 months of the same frequencies, every day, until random noise had a face. We gave them that, not instead of the rest, not as a replacement for capability or technology or experience. Alongside it, in the space it couldn't reach, doing the thing that humans do when you give us enough time in one place and trust us enough to take what we notice seriously. We paid attention. And eventually, when it mattered, someone listened. My name is Major Darius M. Wangi. I am 34 years old. I was born in Nairobi and raised between there and Vancouver, and I ended up, through the specific accident of being 21 and looking for something interesting to put on a resume, as one of the first 43 humans deployed to a deep space relay station at the edge of contested territory. I am, by every metric the Galactic Compact had when I arrived, still entirely unremarkable. The metrics have changed, and somewhere out there, right now, there is a young sergeant on a Tuesday night shift at a station. She's been on for long enough that the noise has a shape she recognizes. She's looking at something in the traffic that shouldn't quite be there, trying to figure out what to make of it, wondering if she's just seeing patterns in noise. She's probably right. And somebody is going to listen.